Hi everyone. Today we are going to be taking a look at a time lapse of modelling, texturing and rigging this model I made a little while back of the Dalek Emperor from Doctor Who. It's a pretty fast time lapse because it's ended up being a much bigger project than I expected it to. There's about 20 hours worth of footage here, all compressed down. But I'm really pleased with the results, and without any further ado, let's get into it. So here I'm setting up my workspace with reference material. The good thing about this model in particular is that it's based on an actual prop that the BBC Model Shop made. So there's quite a bit of reference material out there which I've used to sort of start blocking out the scale and the shape of the model overall. Which you can see I'm doing here, just kind of roughing out the broader shapes and forms so I can then start filling in the detail. So I'm starting to do that here with the eye stalk. It's meant to be a massive kind of object, so there's sort of broken it up, created lots of areas of fine detail to sort of emphasize the scale. So here I'm using Bezier curves to produce the intricate little cabling that goes on the inside of the eye stalk there. So when I'm making models like this, I usually find myself sort of working from the head down, from the top down. I'm not sure why that is, but that's the way it's always kind of appealed to me, is sort of starting with the most interesting part, and then gradually you find yourself working on the bits you don't really want to do right at the end, which maybe isn't the best way of doing it, but I always find myself doing that. So I'm using the solidify and the bevel modifiers here, and a bit of shrink wrap, I think, to produce this kind of hull plating on the outside in quite a quick way. Using lots of the array modifier with an object offset centered on an empty to quickly duplicate things around the outside of the hull. At this stage, I'm mostly modelling with a bevel modifier to sort of harden the edges, and then a subsurface modifier on top of that, which is quite a quick way to produce hard surface forms like this, where you've got smooth surfaces, but also kind of hard edges as well. Again, using the solidify modifier and then a bevel to just quickly cut out these hull panels. Here I'm using multiple instances of the same mesh to sort of see what I'm modelling looks like in situ, but make it easier to model. So I've still got kind of everything aligned to the global axes, rather than everything being kind of angled off to one side and having to work with that. So again, all using the subdivision surface modifier and just using edge loops to guide where the edges should be hardened. I go through this sort of bottom hull a few different times. I try a few different techniques on it, realise I've got the proportions wrong and sort of restart it. Some really strange topology going on, which I quickly undo. So that's a much cleaner result than what I was trying to do before. So here I'm working on the little arms and the claws that hang down underneath his body. again, working on that kind of in isolation, and then using instances of the collection I'm working in to check how everything looks combined with the rest of the model, but keeping everything aligned when you're sort of working on sub-assemblies like this, keeping everything aligned with the world axis just makes it much easier to keep track of everything and not end up with sort of weird transforms going on. Now here I'm trying to create the little cables that run between the arm and the main body, just using a curve, and then here I started playing around with using a cloth simulation to try and sort of hang the tubes automatically, but I couldn't quite get it to work right, so I give up on that in the end, and I'm just using hooks connected to an armature to drive the curve. Just the hooks are connected to the handles. You can get quite sort of nice results with that, and you don't really have to get into simulations and everything. Here I'm using a particle system to generate these sort of hemispheres that are on the outside of these shields quite quickly. Make sure everything that is aligned to the normal direction, so no kind of tedious manual placement of things, trying to line everything up. And you can see everything's sort of starting to fall into place now. The bulk of the model is there, just adding more details. Yeah, this is the final bit of the main model that I'm modelling, producing a sort of ring at the base. Now I'm just kneading all the topology up as best as I can. It doesn't matter too much because it's hard surface, but just trying to sort the shading out, make sure it's not too messy. Here I am rigging up the arms. Quite a simple rig. And now I start working on the little mutant that sits in the glass fish tank. And again, I've started with the eye here. And I'm sort of modelling my way out from that. Found quite a good reference image to work from. And the way I've done this is it's a sort of, the topology is a little bit hard to figure out when you just first look at it. So I'm modelling the parts separately and then sort of filling in the gaps as I go, a bit like a kind of jigsaw puzzle, I suppose. So I can work on little pieces in isolation, and then the topology just sort of figures itself out as you model. So at this point, the base mesh is pretty much done. I'm just neatening it up with the proportional editing tool, and I start sculpting. So I've duplicated the mesh, and then I'm working on this as my high-res sculpt. Initially just with some subdivisions, and then eventually I go into dynamic topology as well, starting with larger details and then working my way up. I tried to do this sort of brain bit with a texture from the internet, but it didn't quite work out, so I just ended up sculpting it by hand. Going in with bigger brush strokes and then sort of increasingly fine ones to get quite a natural distribution of detail as much as I can. I'm checking it in different kind of matte cap materials to see how it's looking. And at this point I realise I've not had backface sculpting turned off, so I've sort of messed up the back of all the tentacles, so I had to go back through there and use the inflate tool to try and sort of fix my own mistakes. But yeah, there we go. UV unwrapping it now. Quite an easy layout. And then baking a normal map. And then from this, I bring it into Substance Painter with the normal map, using the high poly model, and making lots of use of smart materials and smart masks to bring the detail out of the sculpt. I'm also sort of hand painting some detail on the tentacles because I thought that'd be a bit easier than trying to sculpt it in Blender and, you know, deal with trying to sort of wrap things around the edges. Here I am checking it out in Blender, and then based on what I've seen in Blender, just painting in some extra detail where I think it needs some. And there we go. Now I'm rigging him, and this was a painful process that I'm sure someone is going to tell me there was a much easier way of doing, but I'm using bee bones here with multiple segments to create the tentacles, and then eventually I go in and use a spline inverse kinematics constraint for each tentacle, so making each tentacle fit to a Bezier curve that's driven by bones, so that I can then, still using the armature, get really nice kind of blended, curved, tentacly movements, which is what you want really. So you can see I'm doing this one by one on each tentacle, which was not a quick process, I'll say. So there he is, pretty much done. I have to bring him into an old version of Blender to make a displacement map because they removed that for some unknown reason. But here he is in situ in his little glass tank. Posed him up, and now I'm lighting him. I added a bit of subsurface to the material so I can sort of put a light inside him, like he's kind of glowing from within, which is quite a nice effect, I think. Just rendering out some test renders to see how it's working with the glass material. This is all in Eevee, so what you see is what you get, really. And now what I'm doing is I'm splitting everything up into collections and starting to UV unwrap it. Now this was the single worst thing I've ever done in my entire life, I think, because it was so many tiny little edges, because I had to apply some of the subdivision surface modifiers in order to get the right geometry for UV unwrapping. So there were a lot of tiny little edges, tiny little panel lines, and this took me hours and hours and hours just going through, selecting edge loops. Some people say they really enjoy UV unwrapping and that it's really relaxing or something. I think these people are clinically insane, because it's the worst thing, but you have to go through it all the time. I'm pushing through thinking, well, the texturing's my favorite bit, so if I could just get all of this done, I'll be able to paint nice things in Substance Painter, which is what it's all about. So yeah, if you imagine how much this is sped up, this was my life for a couple of days. I'm separating things, color coding them when I've UV unwrapped them onto what kind of UV sheet they're going to be going on, trying to keep things adjacent to each other on the same sheet to make painting across them easier. That kind of magenta coloured parts are parts that I'm going to be doing just using procedural materials in Blender to save on UV space and save some time. So I'm just, I think at this point I was working out how I was going to mirror the textures and that sort of thing to save space, and cleaning up a bit of topology for the last time. And here we start laying out the UVs. I should probably invest in an add-on to help me with this, because it would do it a lot faster and probably a lot better than I do. At this point I really just wanted to get to texturing, so I'm just sort of throwing the UV maps together. By this point the scene was starting to take quite a few minutes to save as well, because I had so much stuff in it, which starts to get quite scary after a certain point. And also with recording everything at the same time, my computer was really starting to slow down. So in future I'm going to be recording time lapses onto a laptop as opposed to onto the same computer. You can see there, as soon as I save it hangs for ages. And finally getting the UV sheets together. And here we are in Substance, finally. Unfortunately, just because of the slowdown from recording, I lost quite a bit of this footage, but I'm mostly just using smart materials, masking them off, and then adding another layer on top and using a smart mask to kind of restrict it into the ambient occlusion, into the cavities, into the crevices, creating sort of a darkening and kind of roughening wherever there's a crevice to kind of try and bring the detail out, and then painting some surface details on. I was trying to make it sort of match the miniature as much as I could, rather than trying to make it look like the sort of full-size thing, trying to give it kind of fingerprints and a bit of kind of a tactile quality, a real physical quality. Here I am using particle brushes, I think, to paint the oil streaks and stuff and give it a real kind of grungy mechanical feel, which worked quite nicely, I think. So we're really nearly there now at this point, making the little ID tag in Photoshop that goes underneath his eye. There we go. And there he is, finished. It was a real mammoth effort. At least I got 20 hours of footage, and there's quite a lot that didn't record over the course of about a week. So it's a real labour of love, but I'm really stoked with how it looks, especially out of Eevee as well. Getting some really high quality textures out of Substance Painter and really accentuating the details and the roughness and the metallic maps really kind of helps to make it pop, I think. So here's a little animation I did with him, which you may have seen on the channel before. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. I think it really came together and it was worth all the effort. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know we went through it really quickly, but there was a lot to get through. And I'll be doing much more content like this, time lapses, tutorials, that sort of thing. So stick around. Hope to see you in the next video.